The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. 360 Energy is a North American leader in energy and carbon reduction. Recently, we have launched the 360 Carbon Excellence Program, designed to make corporate climate change actions more effective and successful. For more information, check the link in our podcast description. Welcome back, Dave and John.
It's good to be back, and it's good to have you back to keep us in order.
Yes, Lysandra, we missed you, but nice to be back and looking forward to this session as well.
So am I, and as we know, today's session is all about COP27. Last year we did our episode on COP26. John, very well educated, Dave and I, so I'm looking forward to hearing both of your thoughts on this episode as well.
And Lysandra, I think John's going to continue to educate you and I with COP27.
I know. I look forward to it. I'm always like, do I need to Google it myself or do I wait till John tells me? All right. So before we kick off this episode, what is COP27?
Okay, COP27. I mean, you'll have seen it in all the headlines and everything else. And COP, C-O-P, it's the Conference of the Parties. And 27 is because it's the 27th conference. And this is a global conference organised by the United Nations with people meeting to discuss climate change. There are also some other COPs relating to biodiversity and other aspects, but the one that gets the headline at the moment is COP27, which this time was in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, and followed COP26, which we talked about, which was last year in the UK in Glasgow.
Now, this is my favorite thing to ask you. Who attended, who didn't attend? Let us know.
Right. This is good. This is good, I think. Would you believe that there were over 35,000 participants? Wow. I mean, that makes you think, doesn't it? And
John, is that down from last year? Because I think last year was 30.
It's round about the same level. It's round about the same level. What becomes interesting, though, is of that, we had 100 heads of states or governments, but there were some notable emissions. China, India, and Russia did not send their heads of states. I mean, obviously, 100 heads of states doesn't represent every country that was there. There were 2,000 plus speakers. There were 300 plus topics that were talked about, and the venue was over 150,000 square meters. This is an immense undertaking, and I'm going to address something about it, which you could say I'm being biased because the UK hosted the last one, and the UK aimed to have a climate neutral conference, and so they worked hard to do that. Interestingly enough, 60% of the GHG emissions for the last COP came from, guess what, international travel, and that's getting everybody there. But it would appear when you look at COP27, it was a case of voluntary offsetting through a UN programme. It doesn't appear that it was driven by the Egyptians as part of putting forward a low carbon COP. I think the other thing on the people there and not there, I think there are two interesting things. You may well have picked up that Greta Thunberg didn't go. She, quite frankly, you remember COP26, her thing was, it's all blah, blah, blah. Well, she's so committed to it's all blah, 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 she didn't even think it was worth going. She thought she could make more of a statement by not going than going. But here is the interesting little figure. Of the country delegations and trade teams, 636 were from the oil and gas industry. It was a very significant representation. And I quote here, "The crammed pavilions felt at times like a fossil fuel trade fair. This influence was clearly reflected in the final text." Now, you could go on, Dave.
So,
yeah.
So, John, I think last year they had quite a large contingency, and as you stated, the research that I was looking at, they look like they were the major force, the largest force that attended.
Yeah, and you could argue that this is this is because they're trying to protect, as the expression would go here, their bailiwick, their area of influence. It could be because they're very worried about what commitments come out. But I've always thought this with large conferences. You have to look at the delegates, who goes, which groups are there, because they do significantly influence what goes on.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's a lot more to talk about what went on there, but in terms of who went, who didn't go, I think that is quite interesting. What we did have, of course, was that the COP president changed from Alok Sharma, who was the British cabinet minister for COP26, but just government minister, downgrading. He then handed over the presidency to an Egyptian, and bluntly, I don't think Egypt did quite the same job before. As we were starting off, Lysandra said she was talking about Googling information. I think the UK conference in Glasgow, there was far more information that was out there about what was going on and everything else. You feel that there's been a lot more, I don't know whether it's regulation or what, but there has not been so much out there in the sort of gossip areas. We do know that the Egyptians, for example, controlled protests far more than they would have been controlled in this country. So quite a different environment.
I know you've got a lot more to add, but I think the next COP session is in Saudi Arabia. Is that correct?
No, it's the United Arab Emirates,
Okay.
and it's going to be in Dubai Expo City, and it's slated to be November 6th to 17th, approximately, in 2023. So we're going to have yet another gap of just 1 year between.
Why?
You could argue because there's increasing urgency.
Okay.
But when we talk about what we think we've achieved in COP27, I don't think that argument really holds water.
No, and I think that leads me to my next question. With COP26 being last year, were there any advantages or disadvantages to having them back to back?
I think there's a disadvantage. One is when you get a big conference like this, your heads of state go there, okay, and you have some kind of an agreement. Well, as a head of state, you can't actually commit or do much to that agreement until you've gone back to your government and you've talked to your people and you've worked things out. And you've almost got the thing that you've only just about processed the outcome of one COP before you're going to the next one. And of course, we say that the next one will be in November, which means that probably 6 to 3 months before, people will be winding up and preparing for the next. I don't think it's a good idea that they are annually. I really don't. I think we need a bit of breathing space, or at least we need, if they are annually, we perhaps alternate the focus from one COP to the next.
So, but you raised a very good point, John, and that is we're kind of running out of time.
We are. We are. I mean, one statement I thought I would share with you was there's President von der Leyen. She's the head of the EU, which obviously speaks for quite a chunk of the carbon emitting world. And she said COP27 marks a small step towards climate justice, but much more is needed for the planet. We have treated some of the symptoms, but not cured the patient from its fever. She then goes along, COP27 has kept alive the goal of 1.5 degrees C. Unfortunately, however, it's not delivered on a commitment by the world's major emitters to phase down fossil fuels, nor new commitments on climate mitigation. And then it goes on to say something positive about the EU. So there's somebody who's reasonably supportive of it and saying, really, and I think this is the headline for COP27, the big thing, and we will come to talk about it, is the climate justice aspect of it. But in terms of the actual mitigation, it's quite interesting. There is an implementation plan being issued, which is now known as the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan. And you go through that, and so much of it is saying things like reaffirming the outcomes of all previous conferences of the parties, also reaffirming the critical role of this, noting, acknowledging, noting, emphasising, recognising. I mean, none of that language is doing language or achievement language. And my reading is, and certainly the lead UK negotiator, which is a sort of lower down position, but an important one, was saying a lot of the work in 27 was making sure that there wasn't, for want of a better word, backsliding on the commitments of 26.
Yeah, I think the
Yes.
disadvantages of it being back to back is that there's no time for policy to be implemented or regulated. It's only been a year. And I think that sort of thing takes so much time and so much effort. I don't really understand the purpose of things being back to back, especially like I told you before we started recording. I was Googling and I thought there was something wrong with the way I was searching because I just found honestly a whole lot of nothing in terms of new content from COP26.
Yeah.
And, we're not at COP27, we're not at COP26. Maybe there's something that the attendees there do see value in, and maybe they go back to their countries and, it's important to them that they've attended this conference. But as an outsider looking in, and now knowing that COP28 is next year, I just am struggling to see what the advantages are of having 3 back-to-back major conferences.
Yeah, I mean, the sheer logistics of it. I mean, we've organised events or conferences or things with, 50 people, let's say, and the complication of just trying to get agreement on things and how you work things out and getting positive outcomes. And every interested party is going to want to have their moment to say there's something. And there are multiple streams. You can imagine, what was it, 300 plus topics? Well, they're not running sequentially. They're all running in parallel. So people are choosing which to go to. I know, for example, that there were various players in the carbon offsetting marketplace who were out there big time trying to push I mean, I don't have the numbers on them, but I think they were another significant, if you like, interested party grouping along with the oil and gas, and you can see why they were there. But COP27 will go down in history for what they say is the historic agreement on loss and damage finance. And this is the big thing about climate justice. And I think we've probably touched on climate justice in one of our previous podcasts, but let's just look at it at the moment. We know that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, they're up there for 100 plus years. So the level of GHGs that we've got today really is driven by emissions that may have occurred 100 years ago. And the argument comes is that the developed countries going through the Industrial Revolution are the ones that have pumped CO2 into the atmosphere. And then you've got the undeveloped countries who are the ones who are potentially suffering most from climate change, flooding, and all the issues. And climate justice says, shouldn't those who've polluted, it's the classic, the polluter should pay principle. Shouldn't the developed world pay for the damage and the problems that it's caused for the underdeveloped world? And this is we have an agreement in principle. Try finding some real hard detail on it at the moment. There's talks of various funds being set up and various things, but at the moment it's just the headline thing. But then you're going to get the big arguments going on. Who is underdeveloped and who's going to get this money? How's the money going to go into it? But I think for me as well, what it does touch on is something that somebody else pointed out became quite a theme at COP27, was more about adaptation. And when you think of it, the loss and damage finance package is an adaptation aspect, not a mitigation aspect. So I think COP27, all we can say on mitigation, all it has done is confirmed COP26. Sorry, to be completely fair, I think we have to say that the global methane pledge, there's now 150 nations in that, but not China. So, that's a mitigation development. But I think this COP, you start thinking if it's, the big outcome has been loss and damage, That's an adaptation aspect, not a mitigation aspect. And don't get me wrong,
So
morally, I think it's right.
the research that I was looking at, that this fund, this new fund that you're talking about, John, this initial discussion started in 2009, developing this type of fund.
Well,
And
they actually say it's taken 30 years. It was first
yeah,
raised 30 years ago as a fund. Yeah.
right. So the information that I was able to glean is they're expecting $500 billion to go in per year, and then each year after you add 200 billion incremental every year. And as you said, John, the question is, first of all, who are those countries that will be putting that money in? And for example, is China going to be putting money in, or should they be a recipient of getting money because they deem
Exactly.
themselves as not being a developed country?
I
So,
think you
so the
nailed it spot on there. Yeah. You have got that problem, and you've got the other thing. I mean, okay, if we're talking justice, then the paying into the fund should be proportional to your historic carbon emissions as a country. If
yes,
you're talking justice,
right,
stand by USA.
right. And now the challenge is, the other thing I've picked up is that all countries don't recognize or calculate the same way. There's a certain standard that everyone's following to fulfill that,
Yeah,
prioritize who should do it. So that's another challenge associated with actually doing this. I wanted to come back just real quick, and I'll play this devil advocate. I actually think a requirement of meeting once a year is value, and maybe not to the certain degree of as many people, but for country leaders, like those leaders change, and so
yeah,
if you wait, there's a good chance that it will get derailed when a country changes leaders if they're not on board with that. And I do think there's some validity. Like I'm just thinking about corporate. I'm thinking corporately. If there isn't
yeah.
meetings with senior management, it's hard to keep things on track. And I use that analysis that I think there's some validity because of that, to keep it on track, to have those senior officials there.
I see the point you're making, Dave, and I'll throw this back. I think you're absolutely right that you want annual updates, but do you need 30,000 people travelling halfway around the world to have a massive conference to actually do the key thing? Could you not do it in a 3 day, like a G20 type event?
Agree. That's using the analogy, John, is bringing everyone from the company to have an annual conference for 1 week, when really it may
Yeah,
just need a selective group that you need to have in that. It's a valid point. So
yeah. But the justice element is a really interesting one, because some of the countries that have not historically emitted, China is a good example, India is another one, they are now superpowers. And you could argue, if you have an atomic bomb, why should you be getting funding? And this is what somebody said to me. And we're saying, yes, but it is the historic thing. But perhaps for China and India, the reparations, or whatever you want to call them, if they are going to go in that direction, they should be charged that they should spend those on mitigating their future emissions, because they are now one of the key current emitters. You can see the complexity in just, if the three of us tried working out what we thought was an equitable process for this, loss and damage finance package, I think we might have trouble if we spent 4 hours on this podcast kicking it around, coming out with something we could agree on, let alone the countries involved. And by the way, we wouldn't be putting our hands into our pockets to fund it. And I was talking with somebody yesterday, completely different thing, outside of work, and something had come up about this, and they said, well, hold on a minute, all this climate change and all this helping people out, we're in the middle of an energy crisis here, how are we going to pay for this? And so the immediate problems, I mean, I think it's going to be a really interesting sell to the voters in the various developed countries, that we're recognising that we've done this in the past, and we're now going to compensate other countries. I don't think many people would have a problem if it was something like the Maldives, a small island nation where they're possibly going to get flooded, plus the fact you can have a really nice holiday. I could see people relating to that. But if you say this money could go to China or to some other country, I could see a degree of pushback.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I know these numbers change and will float, but recent research I'm seeing that we're talking that you need $6 to $7 trillion to actually move the world in this transition. If we're talking about 500 billion, and so that's one thing. And John, if just think about the conference that I was at, the Net Zero conference in Alberta, and thinking how much money had to be invested in Canada. So you gotta find that money. Where's that coming from? And we need to do that. But then you also have to help others. So I think it's a massive challenge to actually.
Perhaps I need another conference next year.
I think you nailed it. Nailed it.
Can I actually just come back on something? You were saying about being at a net zero conference. One of the things that sort of subbed the headlines is that there's an output that the UN, at the beginning of COP27, the UN stated that major focus should be given to the need to ensure that net zero targets set by nations and non-state actors alike are credible. And so there is a recognition there that something needs to be done about the credibility of net zero claims. And I was just looking through here, the other things that reporters have sent strong calls to action, and that was the We Mean Business Coalition. So they were looking to do something there. The G20 agreement addressed concerns about backsliding on 1.5 degrees C, mentioned the global methane. They're saying that Australia and Brazil are back in the game. Well, we think Brazil are, but we now notice that the election there is being contested. We've got another Trump moment taking place in Brazil at the moment. And Australia, we're never really sure where they are going to go. But Australia has joined the global methane pledge, and it's also become a backer of a new green shipping pledge. But it's been pushed to be bolder on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. And I think the biggest negative comment that people have had is, and African nations have come out particularly strongly on that, there is no strong text about phasing out fossil fuels. There's talk of low carbon fuels. There's certainly coal is the bad guy, but oil and gas have not been targeted. And I know we've talked about this before, and we've said that natural gas is a useful transition fuel. But there are a lot of people who are saying you've got to be very careful about that, because are you opening the doors to extending the life of natural gas and thereby creating problems? So I think it would have been really challenging to have been there and come back with a whole list of good things. And I almost feel, and this is my personal view, obviously, I almost feel we're making so much out of the historic agreement on loss and damage, because that is one thing that is an achievement, whereas all the rest are tweaks, minor bits and pieces, and nothing that's there. Now, if you move away from the COP27 reporting and look at people who've been reporting on the periphery, there are a number that are saying, no, COP27 hasn't kept 1.5 alive. 1.5 is dead in the water because of where we are. And that keeping it alive in COP27 merely means the language of 1.5 has been kept in all the agreements. Our ability to achieve it is being seriously questioned because you get this whole raft of reports come out ahead of the COP by various interested parties looking at the state of the climate and everything else. So I think that becomes interesting. So COP27, it's happened. It was different to 26. It wasn't carbon neutral. I don't think we saw too many human rights issues, although we did see the issues about protest being controlled. And it was pointed out, I think for the first time, some of the protests actually occurred within the conference. There was a note there And it's saying that the middle Saturday of COPs is usually a time for people across the host city to mobilise for a climate march or demonstration, urging world leaders to reach a strong agreement. And then it's given that the Egyptian government had moved to limit protesting ahead of the summit, and with many attendees reporting enhanced surveillance, this year's demonstration took place within the conference venue itself. So that's quite interesting. They clearly felt that the conference venue was a safer place to protest than out in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Well, John, I don't know if you have the answer. I certainly, as we're talking about the number of people attending, and we know the implications of the carbon footprint. But for a country to host this, here's the business mind, is it a revenue maker for the countries to hold it, or is it costly for the countries to hold this event?
That's a really good question. I mean, for the conference venue, this must be a money maker, mustn't it?
You would think.
Because I believe it was, and all the hotels Sharm el-Sheikh, as they say, is not a shabby place to stay. And,
right.
You've got a lot of top flight hotels there, and, more 5-star hotels than you can shake a stick at. Now, I know we've got to be careful here. Not all delegates would have been staying in 5-star hotels. There would have been the non-governmental organisations that would have been going out on a budget and probably sleeping 4 to a room in a budget hotel. Who knows? We've got to be fair on that. But I guess all that side of it will have made money. Clearly, the Egyptian government will have had to have done work, provide security and other aspects. Is there an advertising benefit?
I wonder.
The world's been looking at Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. Is there a positive benefit that comes from that?
And then the other question I have, which it doesn't relate to what Sandra's prepared for us, is how do they decide who gets the location?
I will find out. I don't know how that's done, but I think the idea is to share it around. And one of the suggestions was it needed to move to Africa, because that's where more of the impact's coming from. But it's interesting. Egypt, actually, that's not a mega oil state.
Right.
But UAE.
Yes, that's where it's a major.
We're going to get a bit dangerous here, but we have an editor and it can be removed. I'm actually not following it in detail, but of course we have the Soccer World Cup taking place in Qatar. And there's been a whole range of issues raised about having something like that, a global event in a country like that, with its human rights issues and everything else. So it gets quite interesting when you're doing that. And we have seen a degree, shall we say, of restriction on the right of protest in Egypt. I would think we will see a similar level of restriction in the UAE. And yes. And last time I looked, the UAE is a major oil and gas player.
So because of that, what impact or changes will they make or encourage the oil and gas to do? How much will that play a factor in making decisions in oil and gas? That. Anyway,
I don't know, but it is interesting that the idea I thought was to move the COP to somewhere where it was more relevant. And I suppose part of the argument is, can some of the underdeveloped countries host a conference like COP? But I would have thought there might have been African nations and other parts of the world that could have hosted it.
Well, and if I recall, Lysandra even mentioned or suggested that in the last conference, that if we put it into context where people are being impacted, I think the people attending would appreciate it even more so, right? Really?
Yeah, I do think so. So, yes, it's one of those things. And I'm not likening it to it, but it's like the question that's often raised: when you have an Olympic Games, is there a net benefit? And it's difficult to we had the 2012 Olympics, and then there was supposed to be the Olympic effect on the economy and other things like that. We certainly, because of the Olympics, got a number of improved venues and facilities and things like that. We got some brownfield sites that were beautifully restored and made valuable assets to it. But overall, did it make money? I think the first modern Olympic Games that was a money maker was probably the Los Angeles Games. and that's going back quite a way. And that's because they looked at it as a business opportunity. Now, COP is not viewed as a business opportunity. So
right.
Directly,
So
at
staying with
least.
that, it will be interesting to see if in that country if there'll be carbon reductions or emission reductions speed up acceleration because of this conference. That's
well,
another thing to be.
I can offer you an insight, not today, and this is quite slightly amusing. Well, I think it is. I have a close friend who's Egyptian, and he is a retired anaesthetist, and he lives in this country, but he's involved in developing the hospice movement, the end of life
Yep.
units. He's involved in developing the hospice unit sector in Egypt, and he went out for a meeting of his colleagues in Sharm el Sheikh the week before COP27, and as he was leaving, all the world leaders were coming in, and we did question him on that. But I certainly, because he's got family there and he goes back regularly, it's a question I will ask him, and I will see if we can find out whether, if you like, the Egyptian on the street, so to speak, has seen or does see any impact from COP27 having taken place in the country.
Yeah, that would be great.
To mention a positive from COP27, they hosted the first ever Children and Youth Pavilion at COP, launching the first ever youth-led climate forum and aiming at removing some of the barriers that normally affect meaningful participation of young people at COPs. So what I really liked about that is I think a lot of times with these world leaders gathering with each other, they're gathering with people at a similar position. I think when we allow youth and children into these conferences, it gives a bit of perspective of why something like COP 26, 27, 28, 29 are so important. It's because we're shaping our future. So I thought that was a big positive to come out of COP 27.
Lysandra, how would you balance that then with Greta not going? Because Greta I believe, is a bit of an icon amongst younger people with the school strikes program and everything else. And she's actually said, to young people, COPs are a waste of time.
Right. I don't think that one person is ever the model for anything. I don't think that young people should look to Greta as the solution. I think there's so many other young leaders, and you may not agree with every single thing each young leader does. It's similar to like your president or your prime minister, right? You're not always going to agree with every single thing they do. Yeah. I think that climate change is such a big issue that to me, Greta's not the spokesperson. There are so many other people. It's a group of people. It's a diverse group of people from all sorts of countries with all different ideals. I almost was really upset that she took over so many of the headlines and took away from all the youth leaders that were there that were actually advocating for change. So I kind of blame media in that sense. Again, it's always for news purposes, but I do think there was so many positives, and I wish they highlighted that instead of highlighting someone who didn't attend.
I think you're right. We do need more engagement of young people. There's no argument there. And I think there's an interesting view on the Thunberg effect. We had a really interesting half-hour interview with her. I was on the BBC. Mm-hmm. And she was pushed quite hard by the interviewer, saying, well, all you're doing is, you're raising the alarm. You're not coming up with solutions. And she made it very, very clear that she does not see her role as coming up with solutions, that what her role is to keep shouting out, there is a problem, you need to do something. And I've got to be careful here because I don't want this taken the wrong way. It may be something to do with her autistic background, that she's got this issue that she got to grips with and she focuses on, and she can put all of her energy into that. She also said that one of the things she was worried about, if she comments on nuclear power, either positively or negatively or some other source, that I think she believes that she's got such influence that could distort what's going on. So in a way, for her not to be at COP is absolutely right, because COP should be, we already know we've got the problem.
Yeah, Sandra, you raise a good, it would be nice to see if we could have someone in the youth area that was at COP27 that could discuss their role
Yeah,
or what they did or what they see. It would be interesting to see if we could, if our listeners, if you are aware of anyone that is similar to Lysandra's age or whatever, ultimately we're looking for someone that could speak on this. I think that would be really an interesting discussion to hear their point of view.
yeah. I can say it because I'm not in Canada, but who are the Canadian youth leaders talking about climate change? We ought to know, oughtn't we?
And John, it doesn't have to be Canadian. It could be anyone around the world, truthfully,
Could
as
be,
well.
yeah. Because
Yeah.
I think Lysandra has made a very valid point that Thunberg's PR is so good that it's actually probably drowned out other voices.
Yeah.
I would say it completely has, and I know you were kind of saying, oh, if she does speak on something, does it really impact? I would say it does because it takes up every single news headline, and lots of
It
people
takes the
don't.
bandwidth, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It does
and
take the bandwidth.
it's a lot of to know how to navigate the media you consume is it's a skill that lots of us don't have, right? Like you really need to dig through all those Thunberg, media headlines to get to something where you're like, okay, what actually happened with youth at COP27? For me, it took so much digging. So many lines were just about her not attending. And I was like, okay, that's amazing. She didn't attend. Let's move on. Who attended? What did they do? What were the outcomes? And I don't know why media pitches it that way. I think a lot of youth are doing such amazing things, so I wish we could just highlight other world
Mm.
leaders.
Yeah,
That's
I
all.
will speak one positive. I mean, certainly Thunberg has enabled a broader conversation
Hmm.
because there's hardly anybody who hasn't heard of her somewhere.
Yeah.
Awful lot of people do, and I'm going to say an awful lot of older people speak very negatively about her.
Hmm.
But one of the good things she's done, she's recently, for want of a better word, edited a book of climate essays, and that is worth a read. Forget opinions and things on it. It's quite a valuable resource of essays on the climate. But you're right. I mean, it's interesting because she's taking up the bandwidth. She's shouting out a problem, and what I've understood is she's not prepared to talk about solutions.
Hmm.
So where do the solutions come from? How do they get driven?
Yeah, I think what's the tough part is she is 19 years old and she has been starting this climate change talk at a much younger age. I
Yeah.
can tell you when I was 19 years old, my thoughts were not solely my thoughts. My thought till this day, my thoughts are not solely my thoughts. A combination of things I'm fed. I think we need to stop glorifying the way one person speaks because or accusing someone for how they speak, especially youth leaders, because they are still youth and learning. I don't expect a 19-year-old to have solutions to the problem. If her role is just shouting that there's a problem, that's great. At least she's informed millions of other youth that there is a problem and to start paying attention. I think it's a combination. That's why I think we all need to work together. And yes, it may seem like some youth leaders are just screaming there's a problem with no solution. And maybe they don't have the experience to suggest solutions yet. But there are other youths out there that are entrepreneurs and creating new technologies and
Mm.
things like that that could help us climate change.
Yeah, you're right there. I mean, in all seriousness, if Greta Thunberg tomorrow came out with a climate mitigation plan, it would get torn apart
Yeah.
by loads of seasoned professionals and other people saying this won't work, that won't work, and so on. Yeah, it's interesting. I think what I was getting, I'm not expecting. She thinks that climate change is an existential threat. She
Hmm.
sees her future being damaged by it, and we understand that this led to her having depression and all sorts of issues that then led to her starting the climate strikes. The No School Friday thing, and I think that's fine. We don't expect her, as I say, to have the solutions. I think you're absolutely right. I think at 19 you can go, I'm scared, there's a
Hmm.
problem, but not necessarily have the answers. I think what I was trying to get at, because of how much of the bandwidth she takes up on the conversation.
Yes.
Does this drown out some other views and maybe some views that might lead to positive solutions?
For sure. And I think there's ways that youth are making community changes at our age. But I do think, there's, to me, youth is not just like teenagers and kids. We have like the new adults that are entering their careers and also being trailblazers in their industry and doing actual work to mitigate climate change instead of just talking about it. And those people are typically in their 20s or early 30s and things like that. So I think we've been drowning out a lot of those change makers, I guess, figures of climate change. And so we haven't really been hearing about what youth are actually doing in media. We're just seeing youth complaining. And I think that does pitch a bit of a bad light, because there for sure is going to be people saying, all right, so you're all complaining. Now what's the solution? And it's, some of us don't have solutions, but other parts of the youth do. And I think, again, everyone has a different role.
I think it's something worth exploring more, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps we should have the 360 award for a young climate change leader.
That would be great. That would be a good one. So what happens next based on COP27 activity?
I think that's a good question. I think one of the things we have to try and understand is exactly what the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan is, and what comes with that. But a lot of it, as I say, the language in it, I mean, I'm looking at the unedited version, but, it notes with serious concern, it urges, it highlights. I think we've got to see how that gets changed. I suppose at the moment, if we're in the COP environment, the big thing is working out how this loss and damage package is going to work, because I think everything else that's come out of 27 is just saying we've got to stick with what we did in 26 and take it forward.
My response is a little different, and that is, yeah, they need to continue to have that dialogue, but in actual fact, I think we need to just start continuing to act and execute. Don't rely for other people to have answers. Like,
Yeah,
we as individuals, as leaders, as companies, we probably have the answers already. Like probably 50% of this, we already know what to do about 50% of the time. Right now, we could do it. Yeah, it's a great talking point, and it's important that they're doing what they're doing. But I wouldn't rely. It's kind of consistent. I wouldn't rely on government to come up with a solution, or are these parties, for so many reasons. They're critical, but I think I wouldn't be waiting for them to come up with a solution. We got to keep on going at it, and going at it harder than ever. That's my point of view.
Yeah, just to clarify what I was saying if you were a COP participant, and
I
if
agree,
you were,
John. I agree.
then your focus is going to be the loss and damage program.
Yeah.
Speaking outside of that, how is the loss and damage program going to help us achieving net zero or limiting to 1.5? I don't think it's going to be a key thing. I don't think it's going to be a key thing. I think it's really important from the environmental justice point of view. I think if it's done right, it might provide funding that does help at some level with mitigation, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be everything. But I don't think we should criticize it, because, we were talking about it's taken 30 years in the coming, and it does seem to be something that is talking about equity. So.
And just think about this, like, we are so fortunate living where we live in Canada and the UK. We're
Yeah.
very privileged to live the life, and we have had a good life because of that. And these other underdeveloping countries don't, and actually they're being the hardest hit because of climate change.
Yes.
So I want to say this, I know it needs to be done. And this fairness and this funding, I'm worried that it won't get solved fast enough. It needs to be done, but I'm challenged. So that,
Yeah.
I think politics will play in it again. If there's any way that, again, what we can do, that we can help them before this funding arises, if there's unique things, and I think we have to keep doing that for sure.
Yeah.
On that note, what is the biggest takeaway for you both from this episode?
I knew you were going to ask this question, and it's one you asked last time. When I listen and research, like, John, thank you for that research you've done. Lysandra, when I was looking at it for this stuff, it was somewhat daunting to actually get details or make it. I think it's an important piece, and dialogue is critical. I'm a positive person, but I am thinking that if like it's so obvious that it's problematic with climate change right now that if we don't take action, it will be a catastrophe for generations to come. So I know it needs to be done. I would love to urge that to be quicker. I think we in society need to come up with our solutions, collaborate, as Lysandra, you said, and keep moving forward. Like, can't wait for COP27 or 28 to fix what needs to be done. We need to forge ahead, and hopefully the dialogue with the senior leaders around the world will manifest to something. But maybe I'm jaded, but I'm a little concerned that they'll never come up with a solution, and that's a problem. So that would be my takeaway.
Okay, I've got to underscore and emphasize your don't wait. We've got solutions. Let's get on with them. If we wait for this to give us the results, we've got a problem. And then I've got two other views. I think we should say, yes, the positive was the loss and damage agreement. That is a positive. The other positive is that the mitigation goals of 26 have not been diluted. They've not been strengthened, but they've not been diluted. And the other one is, I just wonder if we got 35,000 people together for 2 weeks, if we couldn't make better use of them.
Fair point. I think on that note, what I found really interesting is the three-peat back-to-back conferences. So COP26, COP27, COP28. And we're talking about all the preparation it takes for a COP to even happen. And I think of global leaders, their time is very valuable. They have many issues that they need to tackle, and they're not experts at all issues. I don't expect global leaders to be experts in climate change because they are politicians. That's their role. So when I think of a back-to-back-to-back conference, I'm thinking how much time is taken away from these global leaders and their teams just to prep for a conference? And does it create a different narrative? Like, our country's scrambling to use fancy words because in the past year they weren't able to really get much done because, again, it's only a year. So that's something that I personally want to look into. I really am curious to see what's the prep that goes into a COP and how much time really goes into having these back-to-back conferences.
And to underscore what you're saying, could they use that time to come up with really acting and doing solutions
Yeah.
to move on this?
Right.
I mean, just throwing one in, if you put 35,000 people together over 2 weeks and talked about renewable power and what you could do with that, could you get a better, actually being very solution focused? I think, and I'm adding this on, I think as well, what does worry me, and this is, a very jaded view, is that some countries will regard having back-to-back COPs as an easy way of not doing anything because they can turn up at the COP, say the right thing, and don't necessarily have to act, and they don't need to feel guilty about not doing anything.
John, you raised a really good point. It should be almost a scorecard of this is what you said you did, what did you do, what did you accomplish, and make that transparent to the world on these sessions.
Yeah.
Right? Versus just keep talking and nothing.
Well,
maybe it's getting done, but it's not being transparent. So.
There's the three of us looking at this and going, I mean, we've managed to spend quite a bit of time talking about it and talking about Greta and other things like that. But if you then got really brutal and distilled down what the outcome of COP27 was to the average corporation out there doing business today, virtually nothing.
Nothing.
Agree.
And that's where I think, okay, instead of having a COP28 next year, wouldn't it have been great for all countries to spend that 2 weeks in their own country with a meeting point with all their own leaders and actually make change for their own country? Do the COPs really need to be at a certain country and be an in-person thing? Can they be virtual sessions that actually help you build your plans or check-in points? Just because it's a conference with forums doesn't mean anything's getting done. I do think, COPs should be a designated time where global leaders meet with their climate teams and actually look at their own country and their plans.
Yeah, just a bit of point that we should make clear is the heads of state aren't there for the entire 2 weeks.
Yeah.
They're there for the opening session, and then they leave their negotiating teams and that's interesting, they're negotiating teams, because they're all, well, we want this and we want that, and it's all the diplomacy and all that goes on. But yeah, a valid point. We know that certain types of meeting are just a way of spinning your wheels and getting nothing done.
For sure. All right. Well, this was a great episode. I look forward to recording COP28 with you both.
Yeah, well, that's an upside, isn't it? We get to do another COP episode.
All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Okay, thanks, guys. See you next week.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.